To Miss Austen, Steventon, Saturday, January 9th, 1796. In the first place, I hope you will live 23 years longer.
These are the first words written in the earliest surviving letter by Jane Austen, composed to her sister Cassandra in 1796. She was 20 years old.
Mr. Tom Lefroy's birthday was yesterday, so that you are very near of an age. After this necessary preamble, I proceed to inform you that we had an exceedingly good ball last night.
The letter has become infamous. This is the letter that launched a movie with Anne Hathaway and a centuries-long rumor of romance that has haunted Jane's legacy.
You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking, in the way of dancing and sitting down together.
In 1796, Jane met Tom Lefroy, the Irish nephew of her dear friend Madame Lefroy. In the earliest two letters that survive, she recounts her flirtation with Tom and the events that would spell the fledgling relationship's doom. This is the most extensive record of a romance in Jane's life that still exists. And yet, it is incomplete. We have only these two letters and a few family testimonies from after her death. It seems as though Jane enjoyed a flirtation with Tom, and when the families took notice, they separated the two young lovers. But was Jane Austen really in love with Tom Lefroy? And was this romance so life-defining that it would, as some have alleged, go on to inspire characters like Mr. Darcy? Or is this event a minor episode in Jane's life, exaggerated by the fact that this letter just so happens to also be the earliest surviving letter, and the only one that directly references a potential courtship? But more than just Tom Lefroy, Jane's letters and movements in this time reveal complex webs of relationships. They tell of her debut into society and entrance into the world that she would immortalize on the page. And in this time, we see the first evidence of the most important relationship of her life. This is Finding Jane Austen, Episode 6, My Dearest. I'm your host, Dr. Anne Ferdig. In Sense and Sensibility, Mrs. Dashwood, the mother of the Dashwood sisters, tells young Edward Ferrars,
"But remember that the pain of parting from friends will be felt by everybody at times, whatever be their education or state. Know your own happiness. You want nothing but patience, or give it a more fascinating name. Call it hope."
Jane's emergence into womanhood was a time filled with hope. From her earliest surviving letters, we receive a picture of a young, vibrant woman, filled with the promises of the world unfolding before her. But from what we know of her life at this point, it was a great time of change, one in which Jane was repeatedly parting from friends and family. Like Edward, Jane's future was still suspended, uncertain, not quite there yet. She was on the cusp of independence, whatever that meant for a young woman in the late 18th century. Everyone around her was moving. There were departures, marriages, deaths. She bid farewell to friends and family time and time again. And yet, Jane's life seemed to remain much the same. A few years before the famous Tom Lefroy letter, little Charles left Steventon. No longer a baby, in 1791, the youngest Austen went to join the Royal Naval Academy, following in the footsteps of his older brother Frank. Another three, James, Edward, and Henry, had all left to attend Oxford. George was still in the care of a family member. Cassandra was out in society and courting young men. Jane's ties to her family were some of the strongest she had throughout her life. We haven't talked much yet about Jane's siblings, except to set the scene for Jane's early life. There's a reason for that. There's no question that Jane's siblings were an everlasting presence in her life. Her individual relationships with them offer a window into her world, which considering the dearth of her own letters gives us valuable insight. But biographies of Jane can sometimes become more about her siblings, especially her brothers, than Jane herself, if only because we know so much about them and so little about her. We look to the brothers as a way to find Jane, but I want to see if there's a way to find Jane without focusing too hard on her brothers. I'm not saying they're not important characters in her life story, but I want to find her. Nevertheless, the time has come for a sibling roll call. So here is Dr. Devaney Lozer, Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University, and acclaimed Austen scholar, whose most recent book is entitled Wild for Jane Austen.
Jane was one of 8 siblings, and 6 of those were brothers, and they were definitely a force in her life, and some we know more about than others.
Beginning with James, the would-be poet.
The eldest, James, became a clergyman, and we know that he wrote a lot of poetry himself, and that he may have been a kind of literary support, or maybe sometimes a rival, to his much younger sister. He was 10 years older than she was. But he and Jane's older brother, Henry, put together a magazine, a college magazine in 1789 and 90, The Loiterer. And so he was one of the first published members of that generation of the Austen family. And so I think he must have had a literary influence on her.
Then there was George, who, as we know from episode 2, was sent away to live with a relative.
Her second brother, George, we believe was mentally disabled. He was raised apart from the family, and not a lot is known about what his disability might have been, but it's believed that it was a mental disability. But it was common then for a disabled relative to be raised outside of the home, and that is what happened with George.
Brother number 3 is Edward, the fortunate one.
So the third brother in the Austen family, Edward, is often described as the most fortunate of the Austen brothers. And that's because there were wealthy relatives who were childless, the Knights, who more or less informally adopted Edward as their son and certainly as their heir. And so he went into a different economic class from the rest of his siblings because of this having been plucked out of his nuclear family into this childless couple's home, the Knights. And this obviously changed the course of his life, but it also made certain things possible for his family. And I think a lot of people look at this and like, why the third son? You know, we can understand why the disabled son was not the one who was removed from his home away from home, but why not James? And I think one of the reasons there may be that James had already been selected out as the potential heir of Cassandra Austen, Mrs. Austen, that is, brother, and may have already been seen as a potential fortunate adopted son or quasi-son of this other childless family. So Edward was the next in line. But some of the sources will tell you that Edward was adopted by the Knights just because they kind of took to him, that he made a better impression on him. So that's possible. But Edward is the one who made lots of things economically possible for his family and his sisters, although he wasn't always as generous as I think, looking back on it, we wish he might have been.
Fourth is Henry. Charming Henry. Lively Henry. Terrible decision-making Henry.
So Henry Thomas Austen was known in the family as probably the most charismatic and the most lively and witty of the Austen brothers, and it does seem as if Jane was especially close to him. He went from a career in the militia into a career in banking, which he failed at spectacularly, and from there went back into more acceptable Austen family role. He became a clergyman. He brought his family a lot of pleasure and a lot of laughter, clearly, but I think he also brought a number of family members great financial pain because many of them were also involved in what turned out to be disastrous investments through his bank. So it sounds like he was probably great fun to be around, but also that there were some dangers in getting close to him. You definitely were putting yourself on the edge in following him into any of his work or his passions.
Last, we have what are often called her naval brothers, Francis, also known as Frank, and Charles.
So Jane's older sister Cassandra was older than she was by 2 years, but in between of the two of them was another boy. And that was Frank, or Francis William Austen. And then Jane, and then there was a surprise child. Austen had been the youngest child for 4 years, but then Charles John Austen appeared in 1779. So the three youngest, Frank, Jane, and Charles, I think we can assume that they were probably closer. They were closer in age. And Frank and Charles ended up going into the same line of work. They went into the Royal Navy. And that was a profession one started as a preteen, early teens, kind of wild to us now to imagine that. But they would have been on that track toward a naval career from a pretty young age. But we know that she was closer to Charles and to Frank than she was apparently to some of her other brothers.
And then there was, of course, Dearest Cassandra. Throughout their teenage years, Jane and Cassandra remained inseparable. Jane, the writer, Cassandra, the artist. Cassandra was Jane's confidant, her illustrator, her partner in crime. When Jane wrote the history of England, Cassandra painted watercolor portraits of each monarch. Even as they became adults, their father referred to them as the girls. One niece recalls that Mr. Austen would often, even late into adulthood, call out,
"Where are the girls? Are the girls gone out?"
The girls, it seemed, were likely not at home very often. Their two friends, Martha and Mary Lloyd, lived nearby. The Austen sisters were close with the Lloyd sisters. The Lloyd family rented the parsonage in Dean from Mr. Austen. The only times that the two sisters weren't joined to the hip seems to be when they were traveling. Jane and Cassandra would often travel to visit family and friends, a habit that would continue throughout their lives. But even when briefly parted, the sisters were in constant communication, writing each other letters, sometimes not even waiting for a reply to write again. Jane's letters to Cassandra, which form the bulk of the surviving letters that remain, are expressive pieces that fill the page. Jane sometimes turned her papers upside down or scribbled in the margins. Not a single inch of paper was spared from Jane's pen as she related all of the recent events and local gossip to her dear sister. But there were great changes on the horizon for Jane. While Jane would remain rooted in Steventon, her friends and family were all on the move. Beginning in 1791, when Jane turned 16, marriage was beginning to become a recurrent theme for the Austen family. That December, Edward became the first Austen brother to marry. His new wife was a woman named Elizabeth Bridges. Remember, Edward was adopted into the much wealthier Knight family, and Elizabeth's social standing was much closer to the Knight family than to the Austens. Just a few months later, in March of 1792, James, the eldest brother, married Anne Matthew. Unlike Edward, who was facing the inheritance of two large homes, there was a question of what to do with James when he married. He had some experience under his belt, but nothing like his brother's estates or his father's living. And so the decision was made to give him the parsonage of Dean, the same parsonage where Mary and Martha Lloyd lived. That meant the Lloyds had to leave. They moved to Ibthorp, which is farther out in the country. They would still see Jane, but not nearly as often. To bid farewell to her friends, Jane made a small bag of white cotton and decorated with black and gold zigzag stripes. She gifted it to Mary with a poem.
This little bag I hope will prove to be not vainly made, for if you thread a needle want, it will afford you aid. And as we are about to part, 'twill serve another end, for when you look upon the bag, you'll recollect your friend.
And just like that, Steventon grew even quieter. Jane and Cassandra became even more dependent on each other for company. But close as Jane and Cassandra were, there was a bittersweet element to the sisters growing into womanhood at this period. Cassandra was a few years older. She had come out into society first and began courting suitors. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Jane must have known that Cassandra would leave her too someday, and there would be a time when it might very well be just Jane at Steventon. 1792 was also a year of death for the Austen family. Jane's uncle, Dr. Cooper, died that year, leaving his daughter, Jane Cooper, orphaned. Although engaged to be married, cousin Jane entered a period of mourning. She moved in with Mr. and Mrs. Austen while she did so. Perhaps to cheer up her cousin, Jane Austen wrote a story known as Collection of Letters, dedicated to Jane Cooper. The Hancock side of the family experienced its fair share of tragedy as well. By this point, cousin Eliza was married to a man who called himself a count, and she had just given birth to their son, Hastings. There are two interesting facts here you might notice. One, yes, the man called himself a count. He was known as the Comte de Fayed. There is some evidence to suggest, however, that he might not have actually been a comte. He had money, yes, but a title? That is a little bit more suspect. And two, she did name her son, not after her own father, but after Warren Hastings, her generous godfather who some allege was her biological father. A few years earlier, Eliza had fled France with baby Hastings to avoid events that were leading up to what we now know as the French Revolution. Her husband remained in France to watch over the family's estate. Then, in 1792, Eliza's mother, Philadelphia, passed away from breast cancer. One can imagine how Eliza, who had been so close to her mother her entire life, felt at this moment. Unable to return to her husband in France, Eliza poured all of her time into caring for her son, who had special needs and was often compared to George Austen. A visit from the Comte may have provided some solace, but months later in June, Eliza is believed to have suffered a miscarriage when her carriage was attacked in riots in London. On top of everything else, she was ill with chickenpox and could not flee London for another month. When she arrived in Steventon in August, Eliza reportedly cried when she finally saw her aunt and uncle Austen, some of her last remaining family. Eliza, for all her fabulous and outlandish ways, was already proving to be somewhat of a role model for Jane. The two had very different personalities, Eliza outgoing and vibrant, Jane introspective and imaginative. But in the wake of the tragic events in London, young Jane proved to be a great comfort for Eliza. As Eliza would write to their mutual cousin Philly after this visit,
Cassandra and Jane are both very much grown. The latter is now taller than myself, and greatly improved, as well in manner as in person, both which are now much more formed than when you saw them. They are, I think, equally sensible, and both so to a degree seldom met with. But still, my heart gives the preference to Jane, whose kind partiality indeed requires a return of the same nature.
Unfortunately for Eliza, personal tragedy would continue to haunt her. While at Steventon, Eliza would learn that the monarchy had been abolished in France. Her husband, a supporter of the monarchy, would later lose his head. This is a tragic incident, but I think it's one that is so illustrative of Jane's life in this period. Jane lived through a period of great change. Revolutions, the Regency, the Napoleonic Wars. Jane would never leave England, but through her vast familial networks, she would often brush up against these major world affairs. How must that have shaped her view of the world, even as she committed herself to writing about the small and intimate affairs of rural England? Despite these great changes, both large and small, Jane's life continued along the typical path for a young woman of her status in English society. In October of 1792, Cassandra accompanied Jane to Ibthorp to visit their friends, the Lloyds. The journey was about 18 miles, but this was a special occasion. During the visit to Ibthorp, Jane made her official debut into society. The event took place at a ball at Enham House. Coming out was an important ritual for young women of a certain socioeconomic class. To be out was to be on the marriage market, a sign to all that a young lady had come of age. These days, when people think of young women coming out into society, they often conceive of it in terms of the so-called season, as it is often represented in Regency romances like Bridgerton. This so-called season refers to a 12-week period that followed the parliamentary calendar. when the rich and powerful flocked back to London. And with their return to the city came also the return of the social calendar. For young women of the upper classes, this presented the opportunity to enter the marriage market officially by coming out into society. If you've watched Bridgerton, you're familiar with the common events that mark the occasion, such as the presentation of young eligible women to the Queen at court. For girls like Jane, the concept of the season was not reality. One needed sponsorship, for example, to be presented to the Queen at court. Girls born to rectors in rural Hampshire did not have such connections. And the lavish court balls of London were a world away from the public assemblies of nearby Basingstoke, where one could buy a ticket to attend a batch of balls. The Austen family was of the respectable middle class. For them, coming out was a less formal affair, but one still imbued with significance. Girls like Jane often entered society by merely showing up at a ball or public assembly, usually chaperoned by their parents. In Jane's case, her presentation occurred at a private ball with her dear sister Cassandra at her side, not her parents. The intimacy of rural Hampshire society meant that she likely already knew many, if not most, of the people attending. Furthermore, it was not uncommon for women to remain out for many years before marrying in English society, especially for the middle classes, who tended to marry later than the upper crust of society. Jane's own mother didn't marry until she was 25 years old. Madame Lefroy had been 30 when she married. By the time Jane debuted, even Cassandra had already been out for a few years. Of course, that would not last for very long. For the same winter that Jane came out at Enham House, something special happened to Cassandra. But wonderful as it was equally terrifying. It was the one thing that could threaten to tear the two sisters apart. Sometime in the winter of 1792, Cassandra Austen became engaged. His name was Tom Fowle. Cassandra first met him as a child when he was one of Mr. Austen's live-in pupils. Apparently, Mrs. Austen quite favored the Fowle brothers. Growing up, that partiality doesn't seem to have faded. Cassandra and Tom ran in the same circles, and it is not surprising that a romance sprung up between them. It is believed that they were likely engaged in 1792. We don't know how Jane felt about her beloved sister marrying. Nothing survives to tell us. But if Cassandra were to marry, it would have left Jane all alone at Steventon. Just like her brothers, one by one left. Just like the Lloyd sisters had left. The pain of parting from friends is felt by everybody. Perhaps to Jane's relief, it was to be a long engagement. Tom had not yet made his fortune. He was young and still hungry from a respectable clergy family like the Austens, but like the Austens, he wasn't coming into big money. Tom hoped that his relative, Lord Craven, who was commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Forces to the West Indies, would give him a post. But he feared that if Lord Craven knew of his engagement, he would not send the young Tom Fowle to the Caribbean. So Tom hid their engagement, at least from Lord Craven. For now, Cassandra would remain with Jane at Steventon. With Jane now on the marriage market herself, there may have been ideas that Jane too would find an engagement with a young man in their social circle. But Jane seems to have also been preoccupied with the other joys of adulthood. Dancing, shopping, balls. By this point, Jane had grown tall. Most of her contemporaries related that she was taller than the average woman. One of her nieces described her as
the figure tall and slight, but not drooping, well balanced, as was proved by her quick, firm step. Her complexion of that rather rare sort which seems the peculiar property of light brunettes. A mottled skin, not fair, but perfectly clear and healthy in hue. The fine, naturally curling hair, neither light nor dark. The bright hazel eyes to match, and the rather small but well-shaped nose. One hardly understands how, with all these advantages, she could yet fail of being a decidedly handsome woman.
With all of these advantages, Jane in her youth must have cut quite a figure on the dance floor. And no longer was her world confined to Steventon, Dean, and Ash. Now she could venture out to Basingstoke. Basingstoke was the largest town nearby and an important center for legal, economic, and, perhaps most importantly to a young woman, social affairs of the region. There, Jane would go shopping for clothing and little adornments. Basingstoke was also an important horse racing town, and with the races came the race balls. In the off-racing season, assemblies were held at the town hall, which Jane attended, often wearing the headband given to her after the death of her Aunt Cooper. Jane does seem to have had a taste for dancing, and Christmas in particular was a good season for balls. During the Christmas season of 1795, a newly 20-year-old Jane attended at least 4 of them. At this point in her life, Jane had a flirtatious streak in her. She enjoyed dancing with young men and speculating about whether or not they enjoyed her, too.
I danced twice with Warren last night, and once with Mr. Charles Watkins, and to my inexpressible astonishment, I entirely escaped John Lyford. We had a visit yesterday from Mr. Benjamin Portal, whose eyes are as handsome as ever.
During this period of her life, Jane had run into an old acquaintance, the mother of future novelist Mary Russell Mitford. And Mrs. Mitford described Jane as
the prettiest, silliest, most affected husband-hunting butterfly I ever remember.
Whether or not this is true, we see little glimpses in her letters that Jane enjoys, at the very least, dancing with handsome young men, almost as much as she enjoyed teasing them. It was at one of these balls in 1795 that Jane likely met the young man who would make an infamous mark on her letters, Tom Lefroy. Tom was the son of Mr. Lefroy's brother, and he was visiting his aunt and uncle for the winter season. Madame Lefroy, as you might recall, was a close friend of Jane's, who had watched her grow from an imaginative child to a vibrant young woman. Was this the great love of her life? Some think so. Others doubt it. This famous episode has been reimagined in books and movies, and yet there's so much we don't know. Some feel that the relationship was serious enough that Jane may have very well been on the precipice of an engagement herself, that she might have married Tom and left Steventon just like everybody else. But others think that the popular attention given to the incident is far overblown, that this was just a passing moment. Maybe it was a crush. Maybe it wasn't even that. The flirtation between Jane and Tom appears to have struck at their first meeting. Tom was a legal student, not yet called to the bar in Ireland. He was an intelligent man, having studied at Trinity College. Later in life, he would become Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. But in 1795, Tom was young, unproven, and not yet settled into his career. Cassandra was traveling during this meet-cute, and what we know of the incident, Jane related to her in the 2 earliest surviving letters. These letters have likely become so infamous not just because of Tom Lefroy, but because of their status as the earliest surviving. And yet, from the beginning, we are reminded that while these are the earliest surviving, Jane and Cassandra had a long-standing correspondence, and that we, the readers, are entering in media res, in the middle of the action. In that first letter, written between January 9th and 10th, 1796, Jane begins,
You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking, in the way of dancing and sitting down together.
It appears that Cassandra, away visiting friends in Newbury, had already heard of her sister's antics with Tom Lefroy and had warned her younger sister to tone it down. Balls were an acceptable venue for young men and women to mix, one of the few, in fact. But even then, young women had to temper their enthusiasm. Outside of the ball, they rarely met, as Jane tells Cassandra.
But, as to our ever having met, except at the last 3 balls, I cannot say much, for he has so excessively laughed about me at Ash that he is ashamed of coming to Steventon and ran away when we called on Mrs. Lefroy a few days ago.
But, just as Jane was writing this letter, a visit did occur. Tom and his cousin George called at Steventon. Of the visit, Jane says little.
He has but one fault. It is that his morning coat is a great deal too light.
And yet things did not progress between Jane and Tom. There are many versions of why. Tom was the eldest of 10 children. Like Jane, he came from a respectable but at times struggling family. Jane could do nothing to raise his prospects. Some think that the adults interfered, that neither Tom nor Jane's side thought they were a suitable match for each other. Tom had no money and had yet to start his career. All we know comes from the second of Jane's earliest surviving letters. There is a single paragraph that talks about him, amended to the end of the letter. This was January 16th, 1796. And as far as romantic prospects go, it's a bit odd in tone.
At length the day is come on when I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy. And when you receive this letter, it will be over. My tears flow as I write. William Shute called here yesterday. I wonder what he means by being so civil. There are rumours that Tom Shute is to be married to a Lichfield lass.
The letter continues in this fashion. One would think that if Jane's tears were flowing, she might have spent a few more words on the matter, or she might not have switched so suddenly to mundane neighborhood gossip. Here, in these earliest surviving letters, we broach one of the greatest difficulties of reading Jane Austen's letters, which is to say, how do we know when Jane Austen was being sincere, and how do we know when she was being sarcastic? It won't surprise listeners who have read her novels to know that Jane was extraordinarily funny. Her letters are filled with zingers, and she often made light of situations, which can make her feelings difficult to parse. The Tom Lefroy letters are a sterling example of her humor, the most profligate sitting down together. Even when she says she's crying, it sounds a bit on the nose, wouldn't you say? And yet the Tom Lefroy myth states that this was the great love affair of her life. In his book, Becoming Jane, John Spence argued that this was the romance that inspired Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. That assertion was made into a movie, Becoming Jane, with Anne Hathaway. But many scholars argue the opposite. Some think that this was a relationship of no consequence. Here's Lizzie Dunford, director of Jane Austen's house in Chawton, England.
One of the reasons I believe it's become such a dominant narrative is it actually features in the very earliest letters we still have from Austen. There are only 161 letters that we know the content of that Austen wrote, and we know the whereabouts of even fewer of them, the physicality of them. But the first 2 date from 1796, and they are talking about her relationship with Tom Lefroy. So the first one, it says, imagine all things scandalous, sitting down, flirting, all the rest of it. So she's telling Cassandra about this relationship. Now, letter number 2 is where she details the end of her relationship with Tom Lefroy. It's also the one where she says that when she went to Ash Rectory to see his aunt, Madeline Lefroy, Tom hid from her because he was being so teased about her relationship. This is a relationship, air quotes, where one partner is hiding from another. She also writes at the end that this is the time where I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and my tears flow as I write at the melancholy thought. I have seen and held letter number 2. I can assure you there are no tear stains on that letter. Now, she might have blotted them very well, but there are no tear stains on that letter.
And tears would be rather distinctive marks on the letter. The paper would ripple in distinctive spots. So, suffice to say that maybe Jane's tears were metaphorical, or maybe they were non-existent. Here's another take on it from Dr. Janine Barkus, the Chancellor's Council's Centennial Chair in the Book Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The story is simply that we cannot believe that a woman who wrote these great love stories didn't have a great love in her life. And Jane Austen herself writes in a sort of funny, catty, kind of judgy, self-judgy way to her sister when they were separated and she's young. One of her earliest letters says she flirted with Tom Lefroy. And that line, Jane Austen saying how scandalous Cassandra must think it if she were here and see the flirting and the sitting together and the talking. It's something she says to her sister in a kind of casual way. And we've turned that into, oh, well, that must have been the love of her life. And we've, assigned great actors to play him and inflated that particular story in order to create a Mr. Darcy for Jane Austen, when what she does is create a Mr. Darcy for us. And it need not have been based upon a specific individual, but it is tantalizing, is it not, to think that it was.
How much did Jane Austen really care for Tom Lefroy? Some have argued that she visited him in London later in 1796. A single letter survives in her hand, addressed from Cork Street, the same street where his great-uncle and benefactor lived. But Tom is not mentioned in the letter, and the evidence that she saw him is largely speculative. Most biographers do not even mention it. The answer may be hidden in a more complicated letter, written 2 years later in 1798. Tom had come to visit Ashe again. By that point, he was engaged to a woman in Ireland. Whether or not Jane knew this is uncertain. What is certain, however, is that he did not call upon Jane. Madame Lefroy, however, did. She made a visit to Steventon to see her dear friend Jane. The visit was somber in tone. Jane wrote Cassandra.
Mrs. Lefroy did come last Wednesday. In spite of interruptions from both my father and James, I was enough alone to hear all that was interesting, which you will easily credit when I tell you that of her nephew, she said nothing at all. She did not mention the name of the former to me, and I was too proud to make any inquiries. But on my father's afterwards asking where he was, I learned that he was gone back to London in his way to Ireland, where is called to the bar and means to practice.
So we have no evidence of how Jane felt about Tom, but we do know how Tom felt about Jane. He would tell one of his nephews long after Jane Austen died and well into her posthumous fame as a novelist. He spoke of a love, but a boyish love, insinuating an infatuation or a crush. He would go on to buy one of her letters at auction. We also have some evidence about how Madame Lefroy felt about the matter. According to Jane's sister-in-law, Madame Lefroy had a hand in splitting the pair up. She had sent Tom back to London because of the growing attraction between the two. According to her own children, however, she had
disliked Tom Lefroy because he had behaved so ill to Jane Austen.
The Lefroys blamed Tom for encouraging Jane when he knew he was not ready to marry. But Jane never mentions him again in any of her surviving letters. It is likely that Tom was not Jane's great love of her life. While some believe that nothing elapsed between them, I find it likelier that it was just a passing flirtation, at most an attraction, with no serious prospects between them. The danger of marriage had passed. Jane's life at Steventon continued, as it had before. She would not leave just yet. But that doesn't mean that these letters are not important. In fact, they are. And not because of Tom Lefroy, and not just because they are the earliest to survive, but because they tell us something else about Jane. Something core to Jane Austen as a human being, as a feeling, thinking person. You see, we often speak of these letters as if they were just about Tom Lefroy. As if she picked up the pen, wrote about her flirtation with Tom, and then sent it off to Cassandra. What is often left out of the story is that these letters talk about a wide array of subjects and events. Mentions of Tom are fit in between local gossip and Jane's reports of her dance card. Jane's early letters were not just about boys she liked, they were about everything going on in her life. And from that, we see a picture begin to form of an extraordinary and lively woman. So yes, Jane speaks of her interactions with Tom, but she also talks about shopping.
All my money is spent buying white gloves and pink Persians.
We learn for the first time what an insatiable gossip she is. Even in these first letters, her social observations slice with keen precision and with deadly force.
Mrs. Heathcote is pretty, but not near so handsome as I expected. Mr. H began with Elizabeth, and afterwards danced with her again, but they do not know how to be particular. I flatter myself, however, that they will profit by the 3 successive lessons which I have given them.
She makes jokes and downplays her own wit.
I am very much flattered by your commendation of my last letter, for I write only for fame.
We see the most important relationship of Jane's life unfolding, for these letters have always been about one person, arguably the most important person in Jane Austen's life. And it wasn't Tom Lefroy, or any other man for that matter.
My dear Cassandra, I begin already to find my morals corrupted. My dearest Cassandra, the letter which I have just received from you has diverted me beyond moderation. I could die of laughter at it, as they used to say at school. You are indeed the finest comic writer of the present age. My dear Cassandra, I shall be extremely anxious to hear of the event of your ball. My dear Cassandra.
Next time on Finding Jane Austen. Before there was Pride and Prejudice, there was First Impressions. Before there was Sense and Sensibility, there was Eleanor and Marianne. And before all of these works, there was Lady Susan. In this episode, we examine the evidence around the earliest drafts of Jane Austen's adult works. Thanks for listening to Finding Jane Austen. If you liked today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us spread the love of Austen. Finding Jane Austen is a joint production of Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media. The series is researched and written by me, Dr. Ann Fertig. My executive producers are Jeanette Patrick and Jim Imbusky. Our thanks to our scholars Lizzie Dunford, Janine Barkas, and Devaney Lozer for their contributions to this episode. And to our voice actors, Emily Brady, Grace Mallon, and Adam Smith. Subscribe to Finding Jane Austen on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.